Welcome to Spatial Conversations, the world's first video series recorded entirely with the Apple Vision Pro. I'm Alex Bratton, the Chief Geek of Lextech, and in our Spatial Conversations, we're bringing together experts in Vision Pro, spatial thinking, and really figuring out how do we apply these for business and productivity. So with that, today we have as my guests, we have Brian and Katie from the Lextech team, two of our experience experts, and let's dive into talking about experience design. So Brian, let's start with talking a little bit about what is spatial design and how's it different?
Yeah, so spatial design, if you're thinking about a traditional app design where you've got like constraints around what you're doing, right? You've got a window, a form, you've got an iPhone or an iPad that you're designing for. In spatial, it's really more about the space that you're designing for. So you need to not only take into account the content that you want to display, but also the environment that you're displaying it in, because it can be in an AR or it can be in an immersive mode. It can be sort of mixed reality, whatever you want to do with it, but you have to make sure to account for all of those because you don't know how somebody might use it.
So let's dive into some of those just to better clarify kind of what those different types of environments are. And when you talked about kind of going from the flat design, what might exist in a window, to immersive AR, VR, that's a whole lot of buzzwords in one sentence. So if we unpack that a little bit, Katie, when it comes to, I guess, thinking about VR versus AR versus spatial, anything jump out at you as kind of the key differences for any of those things?
I think it's really just about how immersed you are with the application you're in, whether it's mixing with the actual reality of your own space, or if it's putting you into its own immersive space within the app. And it's really thinking about how are you going to interact with that type of environment depending on where you are.
Got it. Now, have you seen either of you guys a strength in any one of those when it comes to, or even really again, where does spatial fit best versus a VR or an AR?
Yeah, I think spatial is, I think the biggest strength of spatial is that it allows you to bring other tools and other applications in with you. And so if you're, for example, let's just pick an example. If you're like in a lab environment, for example, you can still see all of the equipment around you and you can do things, but you can have information overlaid around that. If you're in sort of a pass-through mode where you want to see content, knowing that context is important as you're designing so that you can make sure to have the appropriate contrast and colors and things like that for the environment that you're working in. But you can also bring in all this other information around you, which really makes it like the next level of computing, in my opinion.
So you mentioned some of the pass through there. Again, trying to make this as real as we can for folks. Anything that jumps out at you as the difference between pass through and just what's traditionally thought of as augmented reality? Anything that you would say is kind of the key difference between even just those two pieces?
I think, augmented reality, typically when people say that, they're generally talking about like something that you could do on your phone or something like that. I think that's typically where people are sort of anchoring. And so I prefer pass through it helps to people think about, no, this is more than just I'm looking at a single device. It's everything. Everything I look at is included in that context. And so for me, it's a much broader sort of design paradigm of every single thing that I'm looking at is all part of this experience that I'm designing for.
Thanks. That helps to really solidify the difference there. And you're right. The AR experiences on mobile apps is just so different than what we're experiencing here. Um,
Yeah.
so looking at some of those, and whether it was when you first went through the wow moments of getting into the Vision Pro, or the many apps I know you've both been through since then, um, any wow moments of wow, this is so different and so special and so engaging that have jumped out at you that have kind of left an impression on you?
I mean, my first experience, I think, was using the Experience Dinosaurs or something similar to that. I forget what it was called exactly, but that was like the
It's got to
first
be
thing
the
I tried.
dinosaurs. Yep.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so for me, that was like realizing like when the dinosaur walks up to you, like I was actually like sweating, like even though I knew it wasn't real. So it was just like that was a super wow moment, like realizing how realistic things can be, and like it can feel really real even though it's not real. And that was just a really cool experience for me, and that's what I make sure everyone tries. And whenever I let them borrow the Vision Pro.
Nice. And one of the things I love about that particular experience is that it's in the room with you. So
Mhm.
it's back to bringing that stuff into my environment. I love that. Brian, anything jumped out at you as kind of one of those wow moments?
I think for me, like I've been doing a lot of sort of 3D work for a number of years, and so my personal wow moment is when somebody else puts the headset on and they try it for the first time and getting to watch their reaction because no matter how many times you try to describe it to somebody, they just can't really understand it. It's like the Matrix. You can't be told what it is. You have to put it on to see it for yourself, and it's so true every single time.
Yeah, which actually I want to build off that a little bit. I took it home with me back over Thanksgiving and I let my dad try it, and he's someone who's very cautious about technology. I found out that he'd never even downloaded an app before, but he absolutely loves the Vision Pro. Like every time I go up to visit, he like makes sure I has it. He asks if there's anything new. He wants to try it out, and and it's super intuitive for him. And he's not someone who uses a lot of technology, so that was really cool to see.
I love that. So just making the technology more accessible.
Hmm.
That's very cool. And of course, I think we have our statement of the day. Spatial computing is like the Matrix. That's perfect. That's awesome. Well, so if we think a little bit more about the Matrix here around us, and you both had a chance to think and go through design of a whole bunch of interesting experiences. As you've done that, have you found any particular elements of just key things to keep in mind when you're designing spatially that are different than when we're designing flat?
Yeah, I got a couple that sort of come to mind. Um, One of the things that I noticed that one of the first things is um, the there's a tendency to think that you've got all this space you can design for and you can make things
Mm.
as big as you want. And so my very first attempt at designing something, it was like huge. You literally had to like turn your head to see the entire spreadsheet of data. And I was like, wow, that doesn't work. My neck would be so sore. And so even though you have all this space, you really have to think about trying to put it into a smaller size for comfort, right? That a lot of the designing is around making sure that you're comfortable while you're using that app or while you're in that experience.
And that is a huge difference. That's not something we thought about in the mobile days of, is this am I twisting my head? That's a really interesting one.
Right, right.
Yeah,
Uh,
I would say scale is a challenge for sure. And it's also just like difficult trying to figure out how to design for spatial. Like, how I make these designs on my screen, how am I going to test it on the Vision Pro? And it's a very different experience looking at it from my laptop than from the Vision Pro. Scale being a big one of those. And then also just knowing there's so much more in the environment. You don't know where this user is going to be when they're looking at your design. You don't know what other distractions are going to be around. So it's how can I really simplify? How can I make the important things pop? That's one of the biggest challenges.
mm, awesome. Thank you. Well, so beyond bringing dinosaurs into my living room, have you seen any, and whether it's something that you've had a chance to dig into or otherwise, just great uses of spatial computing, especially in the enterprise? Anything jumped out at you?
I think the enterprise is still sort of trying to figure itself out with spatial computing. There's a lot of like interesting applications around just if you're thinking about just task stuff, right? Like there's some good calendar apps and some other things that help you do tasks. And while that's not necessarily spatial in itself, it's the ability to take that and put it together with other apps and then also interact with your environment. Training obviously is another big topic that's really huge in the enterprise where you'd be able to bring in remote experts or do other things like that where you can't do that easily in a traditional sort of 2D application.
Mm.
Yeah, and I think also leveraging the like human experiences and connection, like how we're all able to meet here today remotely. Like I think that's one of the biggest advantages of spatial. Like it makes you feel like you're actually in the same room together, and so how you can connect people globally.
I love that. And I know that's been something that we've all had a chance to dive into quite a bit with some of the fun things that we've been working on. And I completely agree with you. I think that's one of the most powerful elements of this is that I'll say the old virtual reality was just so often that solo experience or even cartoony experience. We're next to each other. It's just so different. That's awesome. Well, as we look at again some of that spatial design, any other tips that you would share with folks as they're thinking about taking, especially the iPad app that they have today, and rethinking it for spatial? What any steps they should be thinking through as a part of that?
Yeah, I think for the most part, things translate relatively well as a starting point. But if you really want to take advantage of it, you like one of the things that you can't do, for example, on a mobile device is there's no hover state, right? But if
And when you
you
say
there,
hover state, meaning?
I mean, like if you on a traditional sort of web site, you can move your mouse and you can hover over something and something can pop up just because the mouse pointer is over that. You don't have to click or anything. And that sort of went away with mobile design because there really isn't a hover state there. You just simply tap or you could hold, but basically you design without it. And now back in spatial, there is a hover, but you have to be a lot more intentional about using it because you actually have to stare at that a little bit longer to get it to hover for the hover effect to work. And so you need to be really intentional about making sure where you're going to use some of those new things that you have access to now in a spatial environment.
And does it make sense to bring every existing flat app into spatial, or what? I guess how would you judge what makes sense to even think about?
I think it's important to think about the technology that we get with spatial. Like I don't think everything should just be brought over because it can be, but I think we should use spatial design to leverage what we have and improve upon it.
Well said.
Yeah,
Of course,
yeah,
that
I think
implies thinking.
Yes.
yeah. Yeah, I think if you've got a workflow or something and it requires certain apps that you need access to or certain data, that's a great place to start thinking about these are the things that I might want to bring into my spatial environment, because you want to keep the context of that workflow, right? We want to make sure that even though we've got all this new technology, that we're still putting the users first, and we're still taking their viewpoint and seeing what are the challenges that they have, and then how can this technology help solve that, instead of just trying to take the technology and just use a technology first approach, and then now the users are trying to fit into it instead of the other way around.
Agreed. Well, let's jump out of spatial for a moment and talk about, of course, the other hot topic right now that everybody's digging into, which is AI. And a lot of folks start with AI and immediately take the technology first approach and take off. And what's our platform and the bits and bytes related to it? I know that's not necessarily focusing on the people. Any thoughts on how we actually apply design thinking to how folks are interacting with AI?
Yeah, I mean, do you want to go first? Or do you want me to go first?
You can go first.
Um, I think AI is just another tool that we have access to. There are certain things that make it different than the tools we've used in the past. It's a lot more of a black box in terms of you put an input in and you get something out, but you don't necessarily know how it's going to work in the middle. But still, I think all of the same design principles apply. You have to start with the user, make sure you understand what problems they have before you start trying to figure out, well, what am I going to do with AI? You should already know what the problems are that you're trying to address, and then you can see how does AI apply to this? How can I fit AI in to get a faster workflow or to make something easier for the user?
Yeah, completely agree.
Nice. And have either of you seen interesting uses of AI in design? Has that evolved to the point of being useful yet?
I've seen some things where you use it to check the voice of the text that you're using, so making sure you're using the same kind of tone throughout an application, so it gives you a very coherent experience and also represents the brand well and consistently. So I think that's a good use of it. And then I'm curious to see where it could go with accessibility audits, like just scanning through and making sure your color contrasts are there, your typeface scale is there, things like that, that takes some of the manual labor out.
Got it. And actually, I'm going to tangent us back into spatial for a second because you mentioned some things from an accessibility and a color choice perspective. How does that apply when we go spatial here? Obviously, there's a lot of well-defined standards when we're in the flat side of things. Have you seen anything as far as good ways to think about that spatially?
Yeah, personally, I still think it's a challenge because you don't know like a lot of the colors of the backgrounds and everything. I don't know, Brian, if you've experienced anything.
Yeah, I think some of my first experiments were just taking a normal design and viewing it, and it's like, okay, yeah, that looks pretty good. And then you turn the crown, and now you're in this pass-through mode, and all of a sudden, all those colors you can't even see them. And so,
Mm.
because you don't necessarily know the background that you might be looking at something with, if you're looking at it in a bright sunny day, it's really just easier to use much more saturated colors, high contrast colors, and I think that's why Apple uses white so much because it's the highest contrast color. It really stands out against a variety of backgrounds, and so taking color and sort of limiting it, you have to be a lot more intentional about where you're putting color. You can't just throw it everywhere because it might not be so easily viewed when you're in like a pass-through mode.
Great tip. Great tip. So as we wrap up our conversation for today, I'd like to ask you each for really just your one tip or one suggestion that as folks are starting to think about spatial design, they're leaning in, looking at crafting something, what should they be focusing on or thinking about first? Starting with you, Katie?
I would just encourage them to experience as much as possible. Download all the apps that are out there and see what works, what doesn't work, and then you can get a good idea of where you should go from there, I think.
Great.
Yeah, for me, I think it's really comes back to the storytelling. Like what story are you going to tell with with the experience, and how are you going to tell that story? Because you can have the best design in the world, you can have the most amazing app, but if you can't get people to experience it, then it's going to be lost on them. And so how are you going to take this experience that you have in mind, and how are you going to put it in front of users to make sure that they can use it? And so that's really sort of taking a lot of all those design techniques that we know and love, and applying it in a new spatial environment.
Awesome. Well, thank you both. So, of course, we have to wrap up with the three-way fist bump. Let's see if we can pull that off. Here we go. There we go. Nice. Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for joining us for another spatial conversation.